Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to welcome all of you. My name is Ayala Fader. I'm professor of anthropology in Fordham's Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and the co-convener with Professors Omri Elisha and Michal Rauscher of the New York Working Group for Jewish Orthodoxies, which is co-sponsoring our event today, along with Fordham Jewish Studies. And as always, many thanks are due to Sarit Katan-Gribetz and Magda Teder. Today, we'll be hearing a talk by anthropologist Michal Kravel-Tovi on Jewish conversion in Israel, drawing on her award-winning book, When the State Winks, which is just out in paperback. And if you check the chat, you'll find a coupon offering a 30% discount on the book, and you'll get that again in Monday's newsletter. We are also fortunate to welcome anthropologist Omri Elisha today, who will be in conversation with Michal and with all of us. Before I introduce today's speaker and let you know the format for today, I want to invite you to our next event, which is the penultimate for the spring semester, and which will take place Thursday, April 29th at 4 p.m., when we'll be hosting Mika Ahuvia from the University of Washington in Seattle, who will be speaking about her forthcoming book, on my right, Michael, on my left, Gabriel, Angels in Ancient Jewish Culture. And she'll be in conversation with Fordham's own Sarit Katan-Gribetz. Now onto our program for today. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers, especially since both are not only highly respected colleagues, but friends. Michal Kravel-Tovi is Associate Professor of Socio-Cultural Anthropology at Tel Aviv University, working at the intersection of Jewish studies, political anthropology, and the anthropology of religion. Her book, When the State Winks, The Performance of Jewish Conversion in Israel, was recognized by both the Clifford Geertz Prize from the American Anthropological Association and the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies. She currently is at work on two different projects. The first is titled Accounting of the Soul, The Social Life of American Jewish Continuity Crisis. And the second is called Speaking of the Unspeakable, Sexual Violence on the Haredi Agenda, which is about an emerging Haredi Me Too movement among ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. Omri Elisha is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Queens College and the Graduate Center, CUNY. He is the author of Moral Ambition, Mobilization and Social Outreach in Evangelical Megachurches. He received his PhD from New York University and was a resident scholar at the School for Advanced Research. His research on the anthropology of Christianity has covered topics such as U.S. evangelical revivalism, social engagement, media activism, spiritual warfare, and ritual performance. His current research explores issues of cosmology, professionalization, and expertise among contemporary Western astrologers. So in our best effort to combat Zoom fatigue, here is how we've structured today's program. Michal will present for about 25 minutes or so. Omri will then offer some reflections and pose questions to her, and they will have a conversation. Once these more formal remarks are finished, we'll throw open the floor to some of your questions, which I will moderate. So during and after the talk, please submit your questions exclusively through the Q&A button, which you'll find on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And of course, if we don't manage to ask all the submitted questions, we'll be sure to share them with Michal and Omri after the talk. And without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to you, Michal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayala. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, the Center for Jewish Studies, for inviting me. Thank you, Ayala, again for organizing this event. And thank you, Omri, for willing to be my interlocutor. I'm grateful for this dialogue. I'm just sharing my screen. It took me a moment to recognize Moran and a little longer to understand why. At first glance, she looked exactly the same. Her hair was long and thin as before, and her face was pretty and makeup-free, as I remembered from the conversion class. But there was something else about her now. It perhaps sounds a bit cliché, but there was something freer about her. And it certainly seems funny in retrospect that I failed to recognize her because she wore blue jeans. How much difference can blue jeans make? But she did look more composed, even from afar, and the blue jeans did make a difference. Embarrassingly, but also instructively, I only recognized her when she approached me. Throughout most of the conversion class where I came to know her, Moran consistently wore a skirt or a dress, her arms always covered by long sleeves in line with the modesty code that the three male Orthodox teachers had introduced to the class of mostly young women. But now, only a short walking distance from the conversion school, and only 6 months after she received the conversion certificate, she allowed herself to trade her skirt for jeans. We met at the center of Tel Aviv on the Purim holiday. Someday we picked for this interview, she said, pointing towards the nearby street, alive with the sounds of the city's traditional Purim parade. Those sounds, occasionally picked up by my audio recorder, highlighted the irony of our meeting, that precisely when Jews in Israel don costumes, I met Moran when, as she put it, she wasn't masquerading anymore. In the course of the interview, she told me how much she hated wearing skirts and how one day, only a few months into the conversion process, she already felt she couldn't take it anymore. Pulling out jeans and a tank top from her dresser, she put them on and walked outside, her face shielded by sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, in case, God forbid, someone might recognize her on the street. She told me about the day she immersed herself in the mikveh, the ritual bath, a story that also features blue jeans. She abhorred the mikveh experience. She had arrived there depleted and angry, wrecked with ambivalence about the whole process. Other converts sometimes shared with me the excitement and joy they felt about the symbolic meaning of rebirth and repair and the ceremonial experience of being finally accepted. Moran felt none of these. Instead, apologizing for the graphic depiction, she described being forced to submerge herself in the water, and then explained that what followed was the happiest day of her life. After immersing myself in that amazing mikveh, I left the place, went straight home to shower, and went out for the first time in a long while in a jeans and a t-shirt. I was so happy. I felt so liberated, as if I had shed a building, 80 tons dropped from my shoulders. I didn't have to put on sunglasses and wear a wide-brimmed hat. A real joy, what can I say? A real joy. The story of my encounter with Moran captures the politics of performance and sincerity that are at the heart of my ethnographic account of Israel's contemporary Jewish conversion policy. Moran is a typical convert, a young woman with a background of immigration from the former Soviet Union. Moran has been living in Israel most of her life. She came to Israel with her parents under the extended law of return, grew up in the mostly Jewish Greater Tel Aviv area, was educated in the public Jewish Israeli school system, and served in the army. She adopted a common Israeli Hebrew name, and she speaks beautiful Israeli Hebrew with only the faintest trace of an accent. If you saw her, you would never even realize she is not a Jew. My meeting with Moran, after she had formalized the whole procedure, provides a glimpse into conversion as a process fraught with preoccupations over performance and sincerity. However, there is a risk on my part in opening this presentation with the story of Moran. Hers is precisely the kind of story that is likely to feed the simplistic public and bureaucratic discourses that portray conversion as an elaborate ruse. These popular representations depict conversion candidates as only masquerading, not really intending to commit to the halachic lifestyle they promise to maintain. See, for example, how in the following satirical sketch, the comedian presents the common wisdom according to which Orthodox conversion entails a false and only temporary religious transformation. Since conversion is performed in front of the gatekeeper's eyes, so goes the logic, it is inevitably exposed as an empty act once the rabbis are not looking anymore.
and good evening to all the strange workers here in the studio and at home who are watching us.
Oh, sorry.
Today, you must understand what is the problem with the Jewish. You know, in Israel, we are a lot of Jewish, but there are three kinds of Jewish. They are simple Jewish that you see a lot in the street, medium Jewish, and very, very Jewish. The simple Jewish, like me, for example, we don't wear kippah on the head, okay, you know, kippah. The medium Jewish people wear a kippah that is knitted, you know. Now, the very, very Jewish, they wear a black hat, always black hat. Now, if you, okay, for example, you are not Jewish, and you want to become, like me, for example, simple Jewish, you must first become very, very Jewish, and only after, when the rabbis are not looking, you become simple Jewish.
These representations further intensify when referring to converts like Moran, Israeli citizens with a background of immigration from the FSU, most of whom seem to lack religious inclinations. The perception that converts from FSU backgrounds lie during their conversion process permeates Israeli public spheres. In the social and institutional context where the conversion process actually takes place, the settings of conversion schools, rabbinic courts, and ritual beth, where I conducted my study, the concepts of sincerity, deception, and lies constitute the chief concerns of all parties involved. During my fieldwork, this is what everybody talked about. To be sure, this kind of suspicion is not unique to the case of FSU converts in Israel. Concerns about convert sincerity and purity of heart, that is about whether they might be motivated less by religious intentions and more by political or material interest, animate a broad range of conversion contexts. What makes the discourses of suspicion so compelling in the context under hand is the fact that quite often they treat conversion agents as complicit in the insincerity of converts. On all sides of the religious map, ultra-Orthodox, liberal Orthodox, Reform, and secular Jews, critics contend that conversion agents help to maintain empty performances rather than expose deceptions. Some critics stress how conversion agents, all too eager to welcome non-Jewish immigrants into the Jewish fold and convert as many of them as possible, enable candidates to become impersonators. Other vocal critics emphasize how by imposing rigid and unrealistic religious criteria, Orthodox conversion agents leave candidates with no other choice but insincerity, thus solidifying the role of deceit within the conversion process. This public polyphonic critique of state conversion is often expressed through the metaphor of winking, depicting conversion as a mutually agreed upon and established arrangement of wink-wink. The rabbinic judges seemingly wink at the converts and invite them to wink back, that is, to lie. I draw on the metaphor of wink-wink conversions in order to conceptualize the relationships that emerge between conversion agents on the one hand and converts in the making on the other hand. In doing so, I would like to distance myself from the popular cynical association between lying and winking, to shy away from the hard distinction between sincere converts and deceivers. My central critique is not only that the conversion process should not be confined to a binary logic of truth and falsity, nor would I, as an ethnographer, presume to essentially know how to distinguish between truth and lies, a positioning that would problematically situate me above the social reality which I investigate. Most of all, such a distinction does not help us understand the relationships that unfold between converts and conversion agents. Instead of wink-wink conversion, I suggest the idea of wink-in relations. I suggest it as a way to explain how all sides in this encounter negotiate the incredibly challenging task of Jewish conversion under the current circumstances. The complexity is grounded in a set of three interrelated paradoxes. First, Orthodox conversion in Israel is politically constructed as a national mission, משימה לאומית, and as such, it is an inclusive, even missionary Zionist project aimed to secure Jewish demography. It is fully funded and operated by the state. It is marketed. See, for example, the commercials on the right side promoting conversion, encouraging non-Jewish Israelis to piece together the puzzle of their life by conversion. Or see the commercial at the left side, stating that conversion is achievable. Thus, the message is not only that we want you, we the state, but you can do it, just come along. But at the same time that conversion policy is inclusive and missionary, it is actualized by a generally exclusionary and quite stringent rabbinic toolbox of gatekeeping. Secondly, the state-run conversion project is informed by a biopolitical logic focused on the population and the reproduction of Jewish families, mostly through conversion of young women, as becomes very clear in these ads. At the same time, the daily labor of conversion is focused on the religious observance and sincerity of individuals, as if this labor is divorced from the scheme of the national mission. And finally, Orthodox conversion demands a profound religious commitment from people, but as a national mission directed at the FSU population, it targets those who generally come from secular or even atheist background. The unavoidable clash between all these incongruities weighs considerably on all parties involved. I suggest that win-win relations is the daily taxing labor of conversion, permitting all sides to work towards what is their shared goal, to facilitate and undergo conversion. As a cultural anthropologist, I obviously take win-win quite seriously. In the most basic sense, win-win is an interactive gesture which can create a shared understanding and invite each other to collaborate in the production of refined meaning. Win-win contains an as-if quality, indicating that what is being said may have an additional meaning, that it reflects only a partial truth, and that much remains unsaid. It is not that converts learn how to lie and to feign piety. Rather, they learn how to construct and present a believable persona. And conversion agents not only orchestrate the convert's performances, they too must perform their professional personas as sincere gatekeepers. As much as candidates depend on these performances in order to achieve a successful conversion, conversion agents too depend on these performances in order to play their own role in fulfilling the national mission. Establishing markers of sincere conversion performances lend credibility, a stamp of kashrut, to the entire national mission. Rather than dubious wink-wink conversions, these win-win relations reveal morally loaded and deeply engaged win-win conversions for both the agents and the subjects of the Israeli nation state. For conversion agents, most of whom hail from religious Zionist circles, the national mission of conversion helps produce and reproduce Israel as Jewish, and it is construed as a moral Zionist transaction, a token of gratitude by the Jewish state to its newcomers, a gift given to deserving citizens. It helps them actualize their own religious Zionist script of active citizenship for the benefit of the Israeli state and the Jewish people. A cynical approach will not do justice to the attempts by these agents to do the impossible. Caught between the contradictory demands of their nationalist and religious commitments, they take pains not to betray what they believe is the core of both the Jewish laws of conversion and the Zionist project. For converts in the making, conversion was far from an empty wink-wink performance. While many of them were not motivated by religious sentiments and did lie occasionally about their religious conduct, the gift of conversion was dear and real for them, and the fact that it was given by the state to which they call home made it all the more precious. Conversion allowed them to secure a sense of belonging. It provided them access to Jewish literacy, and it also enabled them a family closure. Winkin relations, so I suggest, unfold through dramaturgical discourses and practices. When conversion agents and converts in the making speak in a dramaturgical language, they do so to engage in a discourse of suspicion, using such terms as act, theater, actors, masks, show, and backstage. By doing so, they reference the possibility of a fake conversion and a compromised sincerity. However, alongside this rhetoric of suspicion, they all interact in ways that I understand as collaboratively dramaturgical, forming a joint rite of passing. Within the limits of this short presentation, I will try to convey some of this ethnographic reality. Teachers help students graft legible signs of proper converts onto their persona. While they idealized conversion as a deep, life-changing religious process, by means of subtle and nuanced pedagogic gestures, they also communicated to their classes that they were in fact primarily interested in preparing candidates for their forthcoming conversion appearance at the rabbinic court. Conversion teachers sharply warned against developing sincerity issues at court. Yet, they constantly taught their students to play defined roles and to manage impressions, what to say and how to say, what to wear exactly, how to make their religious conduct visible. A considerable amount of time was dedicated in classroom to rehearsals, which sometimes took the explicit form of role-playing, with candidates acting out court scenarios. The rabbis in the conversion court also developed winking relations with candidates. Given the relatively thin bureaucratic encounters permitted by the fragmented conversion procedure, the reliance of court agents on legible signs took an immeasurable significance. Court agents clearly engaged in interrogative, even intrusive practices in an attempt to expose performers. Again, they did so by using dramaturgical lingo. But at the same time, they also helped conversion candidates manage and even fashion their fragile presentations and conversion narratives. Judges often performed a leap of faith sorts by tacitly assisting in scripting the very performances and narratives they were expected to assess, helping converts to strike the right chord and find the precise words, and cultivate certain dramatizations that they believed they could trust. Alongside the meticulous inspection of the nitty-gritty of the courtroom conduct of candidates, the rabbinic judges played a role in creating the impressions that candidates made on them. I will conclude with the candid words of a rabbinic judge who told me the following. In most cases, we are in a gray area. We really don't know as much about converts as people think we do. This is why the convert must show us the right signs and present the right figure. And I'm extra cautious not to take it even further and say the image of a real convert. Even the convert's friends have to think she is observant. Thank you.
Thank you, Michal. So I'm going to take a few minutes now, as Ayla mentioned in the beginning, to respond to this presentation and to the book in general, which I've had the pleasure of reading, and then pose some questions to Michal, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I know that there are a lot of questions that people have, and I definitely want to facilitate getting to that conversation as quickly as possible. So let me first of all make a point of thanking Ayla Feder and thanking Michal for including me in this conversation and for allowing me to discuss this wonderful book, which I definitely will begin by saying that I recommend everybody go out and buy it and read it. It's a fascinating, understudied topic that's handled in a manner that is very, as you can see, thorough, entertaining, incisive, and also beautifully written, I should add. And best of all, Michal presents, Michal presents a very complex and a multifaceted argument in a remarkably clear and compelling way. And it's, as you can see, strongly grounded in ethnographic details and historical details and careful consideration of those sort of empirical realities. Now, as you may have heard in the beginning, I come to this conversation as someone who has studied American evangelical Christianity, currently doing research on professional astrologers. So the obvious question is kind of, what am I doing here? My areas of research don't involve Israel, they don't involve Judaism, but I am an anthropologist of religion who's spent the better part of the last 20 years or so studying people who are, to put it mildly, obsessed with conversions, with their own conversions, but also with the conversions of others. And so I'm familiar with the idea that all religious conversions are always essentially social dramas in one way or another. There's this modern idealist assumption that we certainly find in the general public and even in our students and sometimes even in scholarship, that religious conversions are meant to be or imagined to be these transformative events that are purely dictated by changes of heart or changes in commitment or individually motivated intentions that are free of external factors and contingencies. And this often blinds us to the reality that historically and comparatively, conversions are almost always contingent on factors outside the self. There are always conditions that are persuading, encouraging, or even forcing people to undergo a change in religious status. This doesn't mean that we have to regard all conversions cynically, by no means, or that sincere conversions don't exist. Rather, what it points us to is that conversions are always just a lot more complex procedures than we imagine, and that this complexity is a lot more common than we tend to acknowledge. And this shouldn't lead us to feel like we need to ascertain, either as scholars or even as religious practitioners, that we don't need to ascertain levels of sincerity. But perhaps what we need to be doing, and I think Michal's work is an important step in thinking in this direction, that maybe we need to re-envision what we think sincerity means and how it becomes socially encoded. Of course, there are very different contexts of conversion and different connotations of what that means depending on the context. And in a sense, Jewish conversion, and certainly these state-endorsed conversions like the kind that Michal is addressing here, they represent a fairly unique phenomenon in a lot of ways. But as this book shows us, there are aspects of Israeli state-endorsed conversions that, while they are unique to the religious and ethno-nationalist issues of concern to Israeli citizens and the state, in other ways, there are aspects here of this story that resonate with themes of wider relevance to anyone interested in the ways that religious and national ideologies intersect and inform each other, especially when it comes to the processes, whether they are social or political or legal or ritual processes by which we learn to become moral subjects and citizens. So in a way, this really goes beyond just the question of conversion itself. I should add that there's one other minor detail that possibly justifies my presence here, which no one knows about, but I happen to actually be distantly related to the Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who's mentioned in Michal's book, who was the former chief rabbi of Israel. It's by marriage. He was the great uncle of my first cousins, I think, but he was kind of a significant figure in the history of state policy with regard to conversion. So I sort of perked up when I saw that name in the book. So let me highlight just a few key contributions
that I think Michal's argument and presentation are making, and then enter into a direct conversation with her, and then open the discussion up to the wider audience. So one thing that I think is very important, and this is probably the most general comment that I'll make, is that this is an excellent case study for highlighting something that those of us who study religion as scholars all know, but often take for granted, and it's something that's still worth noting and worth accentuating. And this is the fact that there are so many aspects of religious life and of religious identity that are best analyzed once we recognize that they cannot be fully accounted for by theology alone. That is to say, gone are the days when we can compartmentalize the study of religion as though it is the study of practices that have developed from ancient scriptures and religious laws that are set in stone, and doctrines that are either uniformly accepted or resisted in certain ways, and that this sphere of religion is distinct from other realms of politics, economics, popular culture, the sort of religion and paradigm, religion and society, religion and politics. This is a thing of the past, or at least it should be, because we see so clearly how these things are bound up with each other, and that these entanglements are really constitutive of what religious life and religious identity are. And this is true even, and perhaps even especially, for something as quote unquote set in stone, and I do mean that in quotes, as the sources of Jewish identity. Of course, the sources of Jewish identity are not set in stone, but it's something that Jewish identity is something that's often experienced and reified as such. I'm saying this from my own experience as someone teaching in a university that has a very, very high Jewish student population. And whenever we talk about the sort of situated negotiation of identity and the fluidity and contingencies of religious and social identity, I find that Jewish American students can assimilate this information very easily until it becomes a question of Jewish identity, at which points their brains start to melt, and it becomes very hard to assimilate that information, or the realization that negotiated and even performed quality of identity has been part of Jewishness historically, for ages. So even though what is happening in Israel is very peculiar to those conditions, the conditions of the nation and of the political environment, they're also not so peculiar in the sense that these are all kind of negotiations and performances that are not anomalous. They're not exception to the normal functioning of religious life. Religious life is full of all these gray areas. That's not the exception, that is the norm, I think. And I think that that's a very important stepping stone for any really kind of nuanced and enlightened approach to the study of religion, certainly in the times in which we live. I also appreciate that Michal has made such excellent use of a case study that forces us to think about conversion outside of the Protestant Western paradigm of individual experience and agency and personal transformation, because she invites us to see conversions in essentially dialogical terms as a kind of exchange, which is something that I've also looked at in my own work, not specifically on conversion, but on evangelism and outreach in evangelical contexts, that these are procedures and processes that even at their most informal are taking place within interactional frames. So it's good to think of conversion as not just something that happens to a person or something that a person does, but something that is performed collaboratively, not always harmoniously, but collaboratively among social actors within complex, politically organized social fields. And that conversion is something that doesn't just involve a commitment to a certain kind of sincerity, but a commitment to a performance of a certain kind of sincerity. I mean, one thing that's always true about conversions, regardless of where we're talking about them, is that it's not just about what the convert believes, but rather it's the process by which the convert has to make others believe that they are who they say that they've become. That's why in evangelicalism, the genre of the testimony, of the faith testimony, is so essential. And I think that we can look at that across different examples, and that's why it's so productive that Michal introduces this notion of dramaturgy to the conversation. And I think it's really useful here, because there's a stage that's being set for any convert. There's a stage that's being set on which they're going to perform their new status, however that status is conceived. And there are roles that are being set in motion, and there are some agents. I mean, everyone is an agent in the setting of that dramaturgical stage, but there are some agents who have more sway than others in terms of determining how those scripts are going to play out and how those roles need to be played in order for the social drama to unfold the way it's supposed to. At the same time, and here's another really, really important intervention that and theoretical move that Michal is making in this book, that at the same time, while we want to appreciate the interactionist qualities of conversion, Michal's also showing us the limitations of an interactionist frame, that is, the limitations of restricting our perspective to these microsocial dynamics between different agents of conversion. That, she's reminding us that we need to think bigger and think broader. And Michal does this by introducing, as she did in the presentation, this Foucauldian concept of biopolitics, the idea that the work of modern statecraft is all about the management and regulation, not just of individual bodies, but of a whole population of citizens who collectively represent the social body. The state is invested in what that social body is supposed to look like, what the body politic is meant to look like, and how it is supposed to assimilate new and potentially unwieldy elements. So it takes us again out of that narrow interactionist frame and situates the process of conversion into a larger bureaucratic, legal, and ideological framework. The participation of the Israeli state as an active agent of conversion, to use Michal's terminology, shows us that religious conversions are not just about mundane presentations of self, but they're also part of a wider, complex politics concerning governmentality, political imaginaries, and population dynamics. So there's a lot more going on in conversion than a simple transition or affirmation, and its implications are broader than the life of the individual. However, the first question that I want to ask, and I'll use this now as a stepping stone into a bit more of a dialogue. The first question that I want to ask of Michal is, what about the status of the individual in terms of how, in terms of the change or the transformation that they undergo? Is there a sense, in other words, and you hinted at this, you started to talk about this in your presentation when you talked about the repertoire that allow them to convey this new sense of belonging and closure. Is there a sense for the subject, for your interlocutors, that they are undergoing a change in status that's more than just bureaucratic, that's more than just expedient? And how do they describe that status or that transformation subjectively? Is it a sense of the realization of a true self, the recovery of a true self, something that feels alien? Is it just a bureaucratic hurdle, or is it, is it truly transformative? In other words, are there narratives that you encountered in your conversations with these people that are not just part of the conversion performance, but part of their own narrativization of themselves when you talk to them? Again, conversion narratives in the evangelical sense are all about ways of trying to attach a story to one's sense of transformation, which are often kind of very scripted. So in the interviews that you had with people, were they extensions of a narrative that they were being presented with through the conversion procedure, or are they kind of unscripted asides that indicated something else about how they felt their lives and their social status was being changed. And it was about a dozen questions in one, but hopefully you understand what I mean.
Thank you. They have a sense of transformation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
They have a sense of transformation, but this sense differs dramatically and dramaturgically from the way that the conversion agents conceptualized what transformation should be and looks like. For them to be an Israeli Jew who knows something for the first time, I know what it means. I learned all this. I can be conversant in conversations that I was excluded from before means a lot. For them to become who they are means a lot. Like, it sounds tautological, but they keep saying, I just became who I've always been. Like, I've always been a Jew. You know, one of them told me, imagine to yourself that one day someone will come to you, turn to you and say, you are not Michal anymore, but you are Michal. It's like the most basic sense of you, like of being part of this world. So you wouldn't do anything that is necessary to prove to everybody else that indeed you are Michal. So I'm proving. And as I'm proving, I'm reasserting who I really am. I'm reasserting to my dead father, deceased father, who was Jew, and he's not here to see me, but he knows, you know, he can see me from afar, and he knows that I did my all effort to become who he thought he grows like he brings me up to be. And, you know, we keep saying only bureaucracy. You said it, and, you know, we say it all the time. But for some of them, the bureaucratic stamp is really thick. It's not only bureaucracy. The fact that the gazes of the state is not only effective in terms of exercising power, but in exercising recognition. The Jewish state sees me, Yulia, Helena, as real Jew. It means a lot. It's written in my ID. So it's not like a thin paper. It's quite like thickly textures in how they, I think, you know, have their own relationship with the state, which I mentioned, you know, they call home. Many of them told, I won't immigrate again. This is my place. So I will do whatever I do. But I think that you asked me, you lead me to how they narrate themselves after the rabbis are not looking anymore, if I quote Yair Nitzani, and how they narrate. So first, in the conversion performance, narration is a huge part of what they have to do. They have to tell a story. And this story is very tricky, because if they stretch it too much, what the judges will think it is too much to the religious part, you know, it won't be a believable story. I entered into the synagogue and I just felt at home. Really? Seriously? This is how you felt? Like a judge would, you know, say to a convert who just told him, I like getting up in the morning and just pray, Birkat HaShachar. Really? I'm so lazy. How come do you? So it doesn't make sense. Or stories which actually resonate more like a Christian narrative of like discovering God, like really rebirth, reborn. So for like, it's also tricky and it's also slippery. Or stories that make them too much alike Chozrim B'Tshuva, repentance, Jewish repentance. Or stories they like someone would come and say, you know, I don't really transform, you know, I'm a Jew, so I'm just, you know, like showing it, performing it to whoever I need to. So then the judge will say, but you are not a Jew. So they really need to maneuver a space which is quite limited to find the right narrative. And what I found to be the most relevant narrative and effective narrative that ultimately worked was that, you know, I won't lie to you. I didn't search for God. I don't meet him every morning, you know, but I take upon myself seriously the burden of conversion. And once I realized that I'm not recognized as a Jew, even if I thought of myself as a Jew, and I need to undergo conversion because I'm Michal, I'm Yulia, this is who I am, so I will do it. Okay, so you know, it's actually nice. It's nicer than what an average secular Jew, Israeli Jew would say it is. You know, I actually like it. But the narratives that would be told after the conversion is completed, like the narrative of Moran, with which I began, are so much more open. They are not suspicious of me, like the kind of rapport that I was able to create with them grew so much after they finalized the process. Because I think that they knew they can trust me. There were also issues of trust and sincerity between me and them. And yet they were in fear, in real fear to tell the real story. So they allowed themselves not only to appear in jeans and t-shirt, but they allowed themselves to tell a different story, like a selective Jewishness. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. But you know what? I'm going only on Yom Kippur. Yeah, I don't attend on Rosh Hashanah. This is the kind of story that, she cannot tell to the judge. So there is a difference, of course. Yeah. There is a gap.
And one thing that's also, you talk a little bit about in the book, and maybe you can share some of your thoughts about it here, is the issue of performances that don't work, right? I mean, every once in a while, even within the best sort of dramaturgical circumstances, there are actors who, forget their lines or who don't want to, participate in the way that they're being urged to, or that they don't necessarily maybe accept certain kind of interpolations that are being imposed on them. So what happens when there are losses in translation in all the winking that's going on, and how do I don't want to use the word fail, but how do problematic performances get resolved?
I think actually failure is the right word. It is a very rare failure. Like most of the appearances succeed. Like as opposed to the macro level where the conversion policy is a failure in terms of statistics, like so few non-Jewish Israeli citizens really won't agree to undergo conversion. At the micro level, there is a dramaturgical achievement. And in most cases, there is an achievement. And failure, I think that, across, I think I observed close to 200 cases, hearings, and only like 4 or 5 cases truly failed. And they failed because there was no partnership. There was no full understanding of the law of the game. There was no correspondence in winking. So I depict some of those cases. In one case, for example, the spouse was not willing to take the role of an eager spouse. Most spouses, mostly are men, need to present the persona of someone who really goes along the transformation, the taking upon the burden of conversion together with his spouse. And this person was not willing to. No, I'm a secular Jew. This is what I chose. He couldn't understand. There were circumstances that made it for him not to understand. But once he did not play this role, the hearing crashed. Or in a different cases where the kind of sincerity you mentioned, like comparative thinking of sincerity. So I think that I'm talking about Jewish sincerity, which means more an overlap or correspondence or parallel between deeds and words. So in this case, he was not able, like the couple was not able to maintain this kind of overlap between deeds and words. They kept telling things that didn't match up, that were not supported by, what was evidence. Like their performance did not align with what they said. There was a case where a person came and told a really Christian story about rebirth. It didn't align, it didn't work. It was so suspicious. No, you didn't come here to encounter God. You came here to undergo a bureaucratic conversion. So I think because it was so rare, this failure was so rare, it taught me the extent to which those mechanisms usually work in pain, in labor, in really mundane, gray areas that they are left with. It's not a dramaturgical achievement when all sides, ended the court hearing and they all felt good about it. This was also very rare. In most cases, you know what? She seemed okay. This is what the rabbis, were telling me. She seems fine. I cannot say otherwise. This was the kind of feeling, and actually this is why they usually ended the court hearing with a dramatization, like a ritual, a very effective ritual, like making the converts rising up and saying, "Hear, O Israel." It was very, very effective. Everybody was crying, the convert was crying, and the convert tears themselves became a sort of evidence. So failure was so rare, and this rarity, the fact that it was rare, taught me, how effective generally these mechanisms are.
Mm. And you make a lot of you put a lot of emphasis, obviously, on the metaphor of winking, which you talked about in your presentation, and that there's a sort of conspiracy of winking that allows all of this to work the way it does. And there are a few questions I wanted to ask you about that. But the first, maybe you can talk about yourself in terms of your positionality and your participation as an observer, who has choices to make in terms of your own participation, your own complicity in these winking relations, as you call them. And so I want to also get into, I would be curious to hear you talk about the larger theoretical implications that you hope to generate from this idea of winking relations. But even before that, I'm just curious about the fieldwork implications and the research implications of being surrounded. I mean, yes, as Clifford Geertz reminded us, people are either winking or twitching all the time. But once you decide that everybody's winking, how do you position yourself within that web of winks, to use another Geertzian metaphor?
Okay. So in general, I think that we all ethnographers, we wink all the time. Like we are embedded in other kinds of winking relations or in other dramaturgical spaces which we inhabit during fieldwork. Not much has been written about how ethnographers role play, and we role play. You come as a Jew, like studying evangelicals, right? It's a very certain position. And I came with my package, which being a secular Jew, but being part of the national fold. Being part, just simply by virtue of being a Jew, it meant for some of those rabbinical judges and teachers that I was part of the national mission. They couldn't believe that I wasn't in for the national mission. They even wanted me to compromise some of my own ethics for the national mission, to not write about things because it may harm the national mission. So they made certain assumptions based only on me being a nationally Jew. And I think that part of the dramaturgical imagination that came about in my framework came inductively, as usually is, as we work. And it partially came due to my multifaceted positioning vis-a-vis differently positioned actors. So I noticed that when I moved from the conversion class to the conversion court, I need to role play differently. And I realized that I become the in-between person because the conversion agents wanted me to give them information about the converts. Does she really keep the Shabbat? Tell me. You are a woman. As a woman, you must understand in women, right? Tell me, does she look like someone like a trustworthy? And I didn't play along, even paying prices for not playing along. I did not collaborate in these kind of exchanges. But I noticed that I'm needed with the information because they had limited information as bureaucrats. So I noticed that I'm needed, and it sort of inspired me to think in this dramaturgical fashion. We are not committed, I think, sincerely, if I speak sincerely, we are not committed in the same way, at the same level to all our interlocutors. So I was much more committed to the young women whom I met. I was much more able to affiliate with them, to feel close to them than to, those rabbis. At the same time, I must say that I was amazingly surprised by how it was relatively easy to feel empathy towards these rabbis and conversion agents, not only because they were impressive, and they are impressive, they talk nicely and they did their best to not abuse their power, their structural power, but I felt empathy because their mission was indeed impossible. Like I felt as if they are victims of their own positioning. So, I kept moving between all these settings, which were backstage and front stage to each other, right? When they are juxtaposed. So this is what really made me to think in these terms, besides to listening to how they spoke in dramaturgical language. And you asked me about the broader resonance of winking. So I think that first, it takes us to many as if spaces, practices, and habits of as if within Jewish law and within state public Jewishness in Israel. So in Jewish law, there are principles like Rama, loopholes, or turning a blind eye, which are actually very, very close to winking. And it's institutionalized, like it's not an empty rhetoric. It's really like those categories allows rabbis to manage to accommodate and to flexible, practices that otherwise, won't take place. So for example, if you think about selling chametz, there is, like before Pesach, there is a quality of as if in this ritual. Like people don't really sell chametz to a Gentile, right? They do as if they sell. And if you go in the supermarket, in an average regular supermarket in Israel during Passover, you would see all shelves are covered by plastic, as if though this chametz is not there, but it is there. There are categories, as I mentioned, of turning a blind eye. Rav Ovadia Yosef instructed ritual bath attendants to turn a blind eye to those who come with too long nail, like namely telling them, do not look at it, do not see it. Or telling, for example, a synagogue sexton to not inquire into the religious observance of men called to read in the Torah. So, it's better not to know. There are many circumstances in which secular Jews must encounter the Orthodox rabbinical establishment. Brides must undergo a class as if she had never had sex before, right? Before she gets married, she needs to go to the rabbinate and, take a class about sexual purity life. So between the guide and the bride, there is an unspoken agreement to maintain this winking, right? Allowing not to confront each other and to play as if they all agree and as if the guide really believes that this bride would keep now the sexual purity laws. And now thinking as a political ethnographer, you mentioned before the dramaturgical quality of conversion, the social drama in general. But I think now as a political ethnographer that this dramaturgical sense is relevant also to many kind of interfaces that we citizens, we individuals have with state institutions or even institutions in general. I think that dramaturgical principles enact or inform how people encounter institutions and state institutions. So I think that winking relations allows us to think really extended or extending well beyond the Israeli context or the context of conversion, to think about all kinds of institutionalized encounters of us with institutions. The prominent metaphor, organizing metaphor for thinking about these relations of state and subject is usually seen, right? We are seen by the state, the gazes of the state. The state itself makes itself visible to citizens to look, right, to ritualize its presence and its power. But I offer winking as a complementary, like as another, not alternative, but another way of thinking about these relations. Like I'm just thinking, if I had only thought about how converts make their legible signs to be shown in front of the rabbinate, and I had missed all the nuanced collaborations that preceded and sustained this kind of legible signs, I wouldn't have understood, I think, much about conversion. So if I had made do only with the scene metaphor, I wouldn't be able to recognize how these collaborative, like joint performances, make up this. So I think that if we don't think narrowly only about seeing, and we extend it to think through the metaphor for winking, we take notice of how at the interactional level, there are tacit agreements and unspoken nuanced agreement to collaborate for different reasons. Not me, but my very best friends would tell that in their relationships, for example, with the research institutions, they have winking relations. Like, I don't know if it is familiar to you, but as academics, we engage in these kind of winking relations with all sorts of institutions. So I do hope that the dramaturgical principles that I expose here would help us, think in other contexts of institutional interfaces.
Yeah, that is so interesting, and it does kind of go back to something I was saying earlier, which I really appreciate here, is that it is a reminder that in various institutional domains, certainly in the case of politics, certainly in the case of religion, that we even if there's a language of loopholes and what was the other, sort of loopholes and
Turning a blind eye.
turning a blind eye. I mean, I think that it's so helpful to move away from seeing those things as necessarily compromises of ideals, but we can also see them as ways of pursuing and achieving ideals, right? And that religious life is not just about, you're either following the letter of the law or you're compromising it in some way, but that, as I said before, that the gray areas are the norm, and that they are ethical, that there is a certain fulfillment of religious and political ideals within that space of winking relations, as you say. I want to acknowledge one thing and then ask one more question, and then I think probably Isla will be ready to come in. First, I want to acknowledge that you've mentioned a number of things that are very related to issues of gender, and I see that there are a couple of maybe 2 or 3 questions in the Q&A regarding gender. So I won't ask about that. I'm going to allow Isla to introduce that theme, which I think is very important. But there's one thing that I do want to ask before we move on, which is, you mentioned that there is this kind of discourse, public discourse, that portrays the conversion process as an elaborate ruse, and that the converts that they're concerned about their lying, or that there's a kind of stereotype that there's a lying going on. And I'm just curious, I guess, from a political analysis perspective, does all of that kind of ethical worry about state conversion focus on the converts themselves, or is there any kind of public discourse regarding the question of whether Orthodox rabbis should have this level of control over the determination of state conversions? In other words, does any of that critique also direct itself at the way that these conversion processes are structured and the domains of authority that they privilege, or does it all just focus on the subjects themselves and whether they're being sincere or not?
Okay, so I'll try to be short. I see, Ayala. First, even the sincerity issues are not divided in the same way. Like Russians, as post-Soviets, are assumed to know a thing or two about lying to state institutions, so they seem dubious. Other people who may have material interest to immigrate to Israel are actually not even allowed to appear before the court because they cannot immigrate to Israel. So the kind of webs of suspicion already prevent them from being a candidate, from being a convert in the making. And there are other kinds of sort of stereotype of different groups. He came from Ethiopia. He seems to me like he wanted to move from Africa to Israel to have like a new life. But they are so cute, the Ethiopians, they're so nice, and they don't really know how to lie. So there is this kind of sort of like infantilization of like certain group. So even like suspicion is not divided evenly across different groups. So there is much critique from different contexts and positions about the rabbinical court itself and its implication or complicity within this process is very much so. So like there is a lot of writing about judges who make converts no choice but to lie, or they themselves, they lie all the time because they're just like too eager to fulfill the national mission. And because of this critique, there are some alternative, non-stately endorsed Orthodox conversion procedures that just like take place outside of the realm of the state, and they're not acknowledged by the state, by the rabbinate, but they do offer Orthodox conversion, which is claimed to be both very friendly and much more realistic, like in terms of the criteria that are imposed.
But is there a critique of orthodoxy as the necessary authority for adjudicating?
All the time.
Yeah.
all the time, and it doesn't have to do only with conversion. It has to do with how Orthodoxy governs marriage and burial. A lot of intersections where personal status has to be managed and governed by Orthodoxy, or how it managed public life. If you again go in the supermarket in Passover and you want to buy bread, you cannot allow it because you're engaged in this as if space. No, it's not here, right? It's not here.
Thank you so much to both of you. We're going to open the floor now to the questions that many of you have put in the Q&A, and I'll try to get to the chat if we can, but I'm going to start with the Q&A. I will begin with a gender question. You're right, Omri, because a number of people asked variations on that. And the first one is, why is Jewish conversion marketed or predominantly with women? And building on that, I think we'll fold in, a number of people asked why, how reform and conservative conversions might be viewed by women who were engaged in that. So those are really two questions.
Okay, so the first one is very easy because of the matrilineal principle. So, the woman, feels obligated to take upon herself really the burden of conversion because she gives it to her children. So there are 90% of women as opposed to men. I didn't study, I didn't conduct field work in reform and conservative, which are really tiny and segregated, really, I think 50 or 60 people each year undergo conversion in these institutions. Many of the people that I met would have loved to undergo reform or conservative, but they do care about the formal recognition, and they know that their reform conversion wouldn't be endorsed, so they chose the Orthodox. And some of them, like many secular Jews, think that the Orthodox Judaism is the authentic one. This is the one to be believed and to be trusted. And, I wouldn't do something that is not serious as reform. So I would go with the right, with the real thing. So it's a very, very typical Israeli perception and bias, I would say.
So the real thing, even though they might end up not actually following that, which is quite fascinating, right?
Right, and even some of them, even if they don't follow it, they don't feel that they lied, that they necessarily lied, or that their conversion was a big lie. Yeah, I didn't lie. I told him that I want to be a Jew. This is true. I told him that I care about being Jewish, that I want to have a Jewish family. Yeah, this is true. I didn't lie. So I told him that, I would fulfill the commandments. But you know what, Michal, she's telling me, fulfilling the commandment has a very flexible interpretation. So, this is how I perceive it. This is how I take it. So some of them really try to minimize the fact, the empirical fact that they lied about what they do or what they plan to do ahead.
Yeah. There's a question here also about how the conversion teachers, we've heard a lot about the people who are seeking conversion, but how the conversion teachers view the performance aspect of the conversion. And if they're self-aware, do they talk about it?
It is a big part of how they handle their own role, not only dramaturgical role, but their capacity, their role as teachers. They feel obliged to provide the candidates what they need, which means to prepare them towards the appearance before court. So, a great deal of what happens in classroom is preparation for the hearing, for the rabbinical court. So they're not oblivious to performance. This is part of their role, of their perceived role. This is what they do. They keep talking about don't perform, don't lie, but this is a great deal of what they do. And actually they themselves need to perform their own persona when they go to court. When they accompany the converts, they need themselves to be trusted teachers. When they tell the rabbinical judge, I know her, I know Yulia, I know her for the last 10 months, I know she will do everything she says, this person needs to be considered trustworthy. by the rabbinical court. So they're actually implicated in their own performance. And I trace and I write some in the book about some cases where they really made hard choices, but they made to lie to court in favor of converts because they felt soldiers of the national mission. So they had all the time to negotiate and prioritize. Like for me, like some would say to me, for me, keeping up the national mission is the main thing. So even if I don't tell the judge everything that I know about this convert, so let it be, that's fine. I do good for Israel. I do the good thing, morally, demographically.
Yeah. Another question asks about whether there are large numbers of conversions among LGBTQ people because perhaps they feel that their birth religion doesn't accept them. So is sexuality an issue at all in any of these?
No, it's extremely heteronormative in court. I imagine that some of them, are part of the LGBT, but they've never performed in the same way that spouses usually, except to the person that I told to about Omri, they never performed as a secular Jew. They always performed as keeping, we are close to, we are Masorti, we are traditional. So in the same way, converts never perform themselves as LGBT. Of course, it's a big no-no, which is all known. You don't even have to undergo 10 months of conversion class to know that this is something you really shouldn't tell to the court. Yeah.
Thank you. And somebody else asks if you could talk about why people decided to convert, like what their motivations were. You mentioned a little bit of that in your presentation, but if you could just elaborate on that, like what were the social benefits, familial, personal, that they were seeking conversion?
Many of them were indeed young females who immigrated as they were young. Some of them thought of themselves as Jews. They grew up as Jews, knowingly that they're Jews, and some of them only discovered once coming to Israel that they are not recognized as Jews because they thought of their Jewish identity in patrilineal terms, and then only in Israel they discovered the matrilineal. So they, as I told them, really wanted to become who they are. They had plans to get married. They didn't want to deliver a marginal belonging to their kids. Some of them did suffer from being non-Jew. Some people told me I was always, called the Russian non-Jew in class. So I will do everything that it takes in order to pass on to my children, to my future children, like anything that is so much more secure. Some of them took it as a kind of correction to their family story, to their family history. It's only the wrong side of the family, namely the matrilineal, that was not Jewish, but we are Jewish. So I really have to fix it now and to take us back to the Jewish trajectory. So this is the kind of motivations that inform them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We have a question here about statistics. I don't know if you have that, but just how many converts per year and who the majority are. I mean, you've mentioned that many of them are from the former Soviet Union, but are there also Arabs and Christians or?
Oh, no Arabs, no Christians. They are the worst, right? Those who are suspected to be a true Christians only. Actually, I encountered 3 or 4 occasions, like cases where Israeli Palestinians tried to convert, and the security forces had to, get involved in this. So many of them are from a background of FSU. Some of them are spouses of Israeli Jews. They may have met in the big trip after the army in Colombia or in South America. And they just met Israelis and wanted to live here. Some of them come from other Jewish communities, but they're not recognized as Jews, like France or Argentina. And there is a different setting for conversion for the Feres Mura, for those coming from Ethiopia. So they undergo a very different procedure of conversion. It's family-oriented. It's part of their really coming into the country. It's much less voluntary. It's a very, very different story. And about numbers, I told Omri, it's a story of failure. So, although there are about 300,000 non-Jewish Israelis who may apply for conversion, who the state would like them to apply for conversion. Usually it's about between 500 to 2,000 a year. Like really, really, really very few.
Huh.
And there is all bureaucratic discussion about this failure. Who is to be blamed for this numerical failure? Why don't they come? What do we do wrong?
And is that a place where Reform and conservative rabbis step in and say part of the problem is orthodoxy, or no?
They don't step in, they're stayed out, they're excluded, but this is what they're saying, yeah, all the time, yeah, just give us the opportunity. And this is also what the alternative Orthodox courts try to do, as I just told Omri. Like they are non-stately endorsed, but they are Orthodox, and they just try to do it differently. Yeah. In line with halacha, but not via the state, not under the state auspice. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll just ask one more question and then we'll begin to wrap up. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit about all the different players involved. We've heard about the rabbinical judges and the teachers. I know that you've written also in your book about the host families. I was curious how those got chosen. And it seems like it's the converts themselves who should choose a family and how that all happens.
Okay. So there are different kind of professional actors, right? Many of them are the teachers, the mikveh attendants, and the conversion court, a rabbinical judge, where actually many of the judges are not really judges. They're not rabbinic judges in other kind of rabbinic courts. They are religious Zionist fellow citizens who are educators, who are like, they have communities and they step into the national mission, but they do take this professional capacity of being a rabbinical judge in a conversion court. So this is the kind of players, and there are all kinds of policy people at the education ministry, at the integration ministry, all these kind of people, which I actually interviewed many of them. But there are others, as you mentioned, really fellow citizens, or just converts happen to know them on their way to the conversion court. So the candidate needs to prove, to demonstrate this believable persona, and usually she does so, or she's needed, she's asked to do so by provide testimonies that she is indeed the person who she claims to be. So who knows her? So the synagogue sexton would need to endorse her, just like write her a letter of recommendation, stating that indeed he saw her coming every Friday evening, every Erev Shabbat, she appeared in the synagogue. So he would be a player that would be heard in court. The host family, the candidates need themselves to choose to pick up the host family. Just an Orthodox family that they know. Some of the converts need to play, I really know a very, very nice family, but they don't keep the whole thing. They do drive to the beach on Shabbat. Is this okay? Can I have a letter from them? And of course, it was not okay. They tried to negotiate the sincerity and the credibility of the host family itself. So there is the sexton, the host family, some friends from the community. So like all these people's voices need to be heard in court. Again, because the rabbinic court judges know that as bureaucrats, they know so little about the converts. So having this like multi-sided performance of candidates allows them to have like a lot of voices being heard and attest to the fact that, yeah, she is serious, she is sincere, she is doing what she needs to do.
Thank you so much. Omri, any more questions?
No, this is obviously, yes, actually, many more questions.
But
No, this has been a really fruitful conversation. And I do.
Say again?
I would just need to come to New York. There's no other choice.
We tried last spring. Now we have to deal with Zoom. You're going to come next year for sure. We're hoping.
I do just want to sort of repeat what I said earlier, which is just really to encourage people to get the book, especially now that it's in paperback. And I want to add that in addition to it being smart and interesting, I haven't taught with it yet, but I would imagine for those of us who are educators, it is probably very, very teachable in all the best ways. So I'd give it a high stamp of approval in that regard.
Yes, I would too. And it was really a treat to both be able to read your work and to hear you talk about it. And Omri, thank you very much for joining us as well. I'm grateful
Thank
to
you
both of
both,
you.
really.
Great conversation and a lot more to talk about in the future, but it is time for us to wrap up. Again, thanks for the provocative ideas you've both given us, and thanks to all of you for joining us here at Fordham Jewish Studies. Again, Michal's book is available for purchase. There's a discount code in the chat, and the discount code will be sent around again in Sarit's Monday news.